Alright guys, well we're going to um, do this brief set of notes here to take the place of the class that I missed on Wednesday because I was sick, and I'm still a little bit sick, as you can probably hear in my voice, but this is the overview of the endocrine system. So we'll start with this. Just kind of a look at where we've been so far, all the way starting back last fall to where we're at now. So we started out with a little general cell biology and chemistry, got into the histology stuff. Then we jumped into our systems, so skeletal system, muscular system, and nervous system. We picked up the nervous system again this semester, and we just kind of wrapped it up. We will come back to it shortly with our next TBL day, which is based on the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so then now we're jumping into the endocrine system, which is known as the second control system of the body, because the first is the nervous system. Okay, so when we look at this preview question here, this is kind of the idea of just classification of hormones and neurotransmitters. Okay, so when we look down the list here, endocrine glands release hormones into the blood. That's the definition of a hormone, is it's released by an endocrine gland and it gets released into the blood. So endocrine gland into the blood. And then definition of a neurotransmitter is it's released by a neuron and it's released into a synapse. So those two are definitely true. And then the one other case that could possibly be true is this one right here. Neurons releasing hormones into the blood. And this is more of what's called the neuroendocrine function. Okay, we'll talk more about that. All right, so let's look at this. This is kind of a basic overview. So we've got the nervous tissue up here, endocrine, and neuroendocrine. Okay, so the cell in the nervous system is a neuron, in the endocrine it's a gland, in a neuroendocrine it's a neuron. Chemical released, it's always going to be a neurotransmitter. With the gland, it's going to be a hormone. With the neuron, it's kind of something called more like a neurohormone. It's released into a synapse in the nervous system, blood in the endocrine, and blood in the neuroendocrine. Target tissues in the nervous system, it's always going to be either a neuron, muscle, or a gland. In the endocrine, any cell in the body that has a receptor for it. In the neuroendocrine, same thing, any cell in the body. Okay, so they're modulated in different ways. The strength of a signal is modulated in different ways. With the nervous system, it's frequency modulated. We've already talked about this. So low frequency of action potentials means a weak signal. All the way up to a very, very high frequency will be a stronger signal. Endocrine system is different. That's about amplitude. So the more of that hormone that's in the blood, then the stronger the signal we get. So that's what this is. A little bit of the hormone, medium amount, and then a lot of the hormone, we get a stronger signal. Now the neuroendocrine is kind of a combination of this. The frequency at the neuron, the frequency of action potentials on that neuron is going to dictate the amount of hormone released, and the amount of hormone released dictates the signal strength. So it's kind of a combo of frequency and amplitude. Time course, nervous system, we can turn it on and off rapidly. Endocrine system, slow on and slow off. It takes a while to get all those hormones released, but then it also takes a while for those hormones to get broken down and stop acting. Same thing with the neuroendocrine. Actions are very direct and specific in the nervous system, whereas in the endocrine system and the neuroendocrine system, it affects the whole body. Okay, so that's a good little overview. Now let's look at these major endocrine organs in the human body. And so when we look at them, there's a few classifications we can do here. We can mark them as either pure endocrine glands with an E, neuroendocrine, NE, also exocrine is an option. Okay, so let's look at each of these. So the pineal gland is up in the brain. We'll talk about that one more later. We'll talk about all of these more later. That one's neuroendocrine. Hypothalamus, neuroendocrine, pituitary gland. There's two parts to it. There's an anterior and a posterior. The anterior is purely endocrine, and the posterior is neuroendocrine. Thyroid gland is pure endocrine. Parathyroid glands, which is these little dots on the on the endocrine gland. That's it. On the thyroid gland. That's endocrine as well. The thymus kind of wraps around the bronchus. That's endocrine. And then we have the adrenal glands. They're also a mix of endocrine and neuroendocrine, depending on whether we're talking about the adrenal medulla, which is neuroendocrine, or the adrenal cortex, which is endocrine. Okay, pancreas. Pancreas is purely endocrine in some parts. The parts that release insulin and glucagon. Those are very important hormones for our blood sugar. But then there's also the exocrine functions, all of the digestive enzymes that are released into the digestive tract, considered an exocrine. And then the gonads, so ovary in female, testes in male, they also are endocrine as well as exocrine. Okay, so that's a little overview of those. This is just kind of a look at how hormones get released and what they do. So when we have an endocrine cell like this, which would just be part of a gland, we have these little hormones here. They're released. They get released by exocytosis. They diffuse through the endothelial layer, the epithelial tissue there, and then blood vessels get into the bloodstream, and then they travel down. Right, they're traveling down, make their way through the veins back to the heart. Right, heart's going to pump those out in the arteries, and then they're going to make their way through the blood and diffuse into the tissues and interact with cells that have specific receptors for that. And that's really how hormones work. This happens all over the body. So a little bit about how to talk about the endocrine system. We kind of call it the grammar of the endocrine system. When we talk about, use these terms stimulation or inhibition, kind of a thing to fill out here, what is stimulated or inhibited? So our organs, hormones, or release. So we could say that we stimulate an organ to release a hormone, right? Or we inhibit an organ. So we could say that we stimulate the thyroid gland to release something. We wouldn't say that we stimulate the thyroid hormones. So we could say that we stimulate or inhibit those. We could also say we stimulate the release of hormones. And what do we say is released or not released? We definitely don't say that organs are released. We don't say that glands are released. We do say that hormones are released. Okay, so sentence structure. So an example here, blank, the hormone stimulates release of another hormone from a gland. Okay, and then second example, number 2, the hormone inhibits the release of another hormone from a gland. Now we have some names that we use depending on what those hormones do. So a certain class of those called stimulating hormones, and they're named according to the gland that they stimulate. But then we have releasing and inhibiting hormones, and these are named according to the hormone whose release they affect. So which sentence structure is correct? We can take a look at those. So angiotensin 2 stimulates the release of the adrenal gland. No, we don't release a gland, right? Angiotensin 2 stimulates the release of aldosterone from the adrenal gland. That one is good. Aldosterone is released by the stimulation of angiotensin. No. Adrenal gland stimulates the release of aldosterone from it. No. So B is correct. Okay, a couple different ways that we regulate control of secretion. We have what's called humoral stimulus, which means the level of a substance in the blood stimulates a gland to release a hormone. Humor means fluid. Neural stimulus means a neuron directly stimulates a gland to release a hormone. And then hormonal stimulus, there are a couple different types. Tropic hormones stimulate a gland to release another hormone. That means hormonal stimulus means another hormone is the stimulus for the release of that hormone. And some also cause growth of the second gland in addition to stimulating the release of that hormone. If they cause growth, then they're known as a trophic hormone. Okay? So tropic hormones are different. Those stimulate the gland to release another hormone, but trophic cause that gland to grow as well. So now negative feedback loops, high levels of one hormone inhibit further release of that hormone or another hormone. And we'll see some of those. So some examples. the hypothalamus, to the pituitary hormones to target organs. Okay, so one example here is a thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, which stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. Okay, so that's an example of a hormonal stimulus. All right, so hypothalamus here releases down to the pituitary, pituitary releases down to the thyroid. You can see that TRH would be here, TSH would be here, and then T3, T4 would be there. So this one's hormonal. Okay. Next one. A couple examples here. This is the hormone release caused by altered or leveled levels of certain critical ions or nutrients. Okay, so we see the parathyroid glands. They're responding to low blood calcium. We've got low blood calcium that causes the release of parathyroid hormone. So that's humoral stimulus. Okay, insulin and glucagon in the same way, based on glucose levels. This one's based on calcium. Okay, and then lastly, we have the neural stimulus. Neural stimulus, an example of this is the adrenal medulla. When we have stress, that activates our sympathetic nervous system. That causes release of norepinephrine and epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. And so we see it's a neuron coming from the spinal cord right to the adrenal medulla. It causes release of epi and norepi. So that's direct stimulation by the nervous system. Okay, so a couple examples of feedback loops here. Negative feedback loop means that one hormone inhibits the release of another. If it's a short type, then the first hormone inhibits release of the second, but then the second hormone also inhibits release of the first hormone. So that would be shown here, where the anterior pituitary releases a hormone, and that directly inhibits the release of the first hormone that was released by the hypothalamus. But then a long example would be the thyroid hormone that was released, goes back and inhibits all the way back to the hypothalamus. In some cases, we can have positive feedback, and that is the initial release of a hormone stimulates further release. So two examples of this are oxytocin, released during labor, and then estrogen during ovulation. We'll talk about both of those soon. Yeah, again, that was the TRH and the TSH. Okay, so a little bit about hormone secretion patterns. We've got three main categories of this. Chronic secretion means that we have a level maintained, constant, very tight negative feedback control. For example, if this is the thyroid hormones, we always need a certain level of thyroid hormones to regulate our metabolism. Acute secretion patterns. Hormone levels increase dramatically in response to stimulus. Epinephrine during exercise or any other stress. Calcitonin when we have high calcium, so it shoots up a lot when we need it. And then cyclic is a regular pattern of release, usually controlled by the nervous system. So cortisol, we get a rise of cortisol in the morning to help us deal with the stress of waking up. Estrogen spikes during different phases of the menstrual cycle, so another example of cyclic. So which one is which here? So we see a nice tight control here with the chronic. We see the acute here. Only reason we know that is because we have a stimulus, right? And then cyclic, we see kind of a pattern to these rise and falls that happens over days, not just over minutes or hours like that. Okay, a little bit more hormone terminology. A couple terms here. Permissiveness is one hormone needs the presence of another hormone to have its effect. For example, growth hormone requires the presence of thyroid hormones for growth because we can't build proteins unless we have ATP in metabolism. So thyroid hormones drive metabolism, while the growth hormone drives protein synthesis. Synergism is two hormones with the same effect. They amplify each other. So during exercise, we need lots of glucose to be released. So epinephrine helps us do that, So does glucagon. We need both of them to give us plenty of glucose release. Then we have some that are antagonistic to each other. They have the opposite effects. Insulin and glucagon are just that way. Growth hormone is anabolic, cortisol is catabolic, also opposite effects. Okay, and then just real briefly here, the hormone types. 3 main chemical structures of hormones: amino acid derived, protein, and steroid hormones. Amino acid derived, you can see, are modified amino acids. A lot of these are neurotransmitters as well. Their mode of action is they bind to cell receptors, and then they use that second messenger system that we've talked about before. Examples of these, you can see those there. You can see almost all of those, except the thyroid hormones, are also neurotransmitters. Proteins, obviously made in the rough ER like all proteins are. Some are glycoproteins. They also bind to cell receptors, start the second messenger system. Examples of those: thyrotropin-releasing hormones, calcitonin, parathyroid, oxytocin. There's a lot of different protein hormones. And then steroids, these are derived from cholesterol. They're made in the smooth ER because they're a fat. They can't really be stored because they're lipid soluble. And they do something different the way they act. They bind to intracellular receptors that actually make their way into the cell, through the cell membrane, and they directly can start messenger RNA synthesis. They a lot of times are transcription factors. Examples of these: estrogen, cortisol, testosterone, progesterone. All right, guys, that's it. We'll see you soon.